What is postmodernism? And is this term useful when we're trying to talk about contemporary music? Lucky for you, I just finished teaching an actual real-life college class in this subject. By the way, Alan, your son says hi. Lots of very smart people have said a lot about postmodernism, both broadly and within music. There are some contradictions, for sure, and solid definitions are hard to come by, but nevertheless, I think that this discourse can help us understand the many trends of music from the past century. In order to define postmodernism, we have to define modernism. In music, modernism rose around the same time as atonality, a lack of tonality, that is, an absence of a certain kind of musical grammar. Debussy wrote atonal music, but in a very different way than Arnold Schoenberg, whose music is more systematic and dissonant. Technology, from the theremin to the synthesizer, was also a part of modernism, especially the post-World War II generation, where technology had advanced to the point of constantly threatening human life. This rapid change in the human experience necessitated a break with tradition, a questioning of formal assumptions. Within Western art music, this spawned a number of smaller movements and schools of thought that, in response to this new paradigm, replaced the old musical grammar, classical tonality with all of its expectations, with newer forms of musical expression, from 12-tone music and then total serialism, all the way to performance art, Fluxus, and the New York downtown school that questioned the boundaries of music and the centrality of the composer. Postmodernism goes beyond that, and when it comes to music in particular, I think it's best understood as a critique of modernism using modernism's own tools. Postmodernism is hard to define because its entire attitude is one of questioning all narratives and received wisdom, including those from modernism. Modernism broke with tradition and placed more emphasis on subjective experiences. Postmodernism takes that a step further. Nevertheless, postmodernism remains, as Jonathan Kramer put it in his final book, Postmodern Music, Postmodern Listening, quote, a maddeningly imprecise musical concept. Linda Hutcheon, in her book Poetics of Postmodernism, says that it is a contradictory phenomenon, one that uses and abuses, installs and then subverts the very concepts it challenges. I've met more than one musical academic who outright rejects the very idea that music can be postmodern. No matter what pieces or concepts I put forth as postmodern, they say it's all just modern. The problem these people have, I think, is that they want postmodernism to chronologically follow modernism, just as Romanticism chronologically followed classicism. But postmodernism isn't some historical era with known boundary points, it's more of an attitude. Kramer again. To look for historical precedents leading toward postmodernism would be to accept the idea of historical progress, which postmodernists challenge. So you can see the ways in which postmodernism questions everything makes it hard to define positively. I think there's something to postmodern as a category, as a way of understanding various trends, and even as a mode of listening to music that predates modernism. Modernism, for all its questioning of the past, still prized unity. If you look at a building by Frank Lloyd Wright, there's a sense of contiguity, of clarity, of this is all the same thing. If you look at Philip Johnson's Glass House, it's modernist in that no one wanted to, or even could, do this in a previous era. But there's still an aesthetic consistency, something that we might call unity. In the same way, a graphic score by Earl Brown may bear no resemblance to any traditional score, but it's internally consistent. Modernism may question the narratives of received wisdom, but it does not question the meta-narrative of creative unity. Thus the prevalence of 12-tone music in the 20th century, because compositional unity was assured at a cellular level if you used serial technique. By taking the questioning of tradition just one step further, postmodernism questions unity entirely. A piece of art could contain any number of disunities and internal contradictions. In music, an already abstract art that exists more in time than in space, there are a number of postmodern techniques that stem from this central notion of disunity. Kramer's analysis includes a list of 16 characteristics. He's careful to stress that this is not a checklist, and in practice, I find that many of these overlap. Numbers 4 and 5, for instance, are both about blurring the distinction between high art and popular art, what high modernists would disdainfully call entertainment rather than art. Modernist composers do not include quotations of pop tunes in highly rigorous intellectual compositions, because to do so is to question some of the few consistent values of modernism, because doing so questions unity. Numbers 7 through 13 are likewise variations on this theme of structural disunity. Where modernism prizes consistency, logic, unity, and a segregation of art from entertainment, postmodernism uses inconsistency, indeterminacy, disunity, and makes no distinction between high and low art, or for that matter, old and new techniques. Modernism, especially in music, has a high level of historical self-awareness that rejects the old. Postmodernism looks at Gregorian chants, Mozart sonatas, free jazz, Ghanaian folk music, and Balinese gamelan not as things to be potentially synthesized into a greater unified whole, but items on a grand historical buffet, available for all to coexist on one's musical plate. The past can be as alive as the present. The notion of historical progress is jettisoned along with unity. So what are some of the ways that composers have embedded this narrative questioning, time as a flat circle approach to musical materials in their work? One is in the use of quotation and intertextuality to build meaning. When Charles Ives quotes a hymn tune or a whole bunch of popular and patriotic music, the meaning of the piece changes dramatically based on the audience. The meaning of the piece is less in the piece itself and more in the network of relationships it builds with all the different pieces it quotes. Meaning ultimately lies in the listener's interpretation based on their knowledge. Likewise, if there is a classic of musical postmodernism, it would be the third movement of Luciano Berio's Sinfonia, which adds layers and layers of quotation and intertextual references on top of a Mahler symphonic movement. The soloists, conductor, and other music on the program in the same performance is all part of a highly self-aware and self-referential score.
But seeing Daphne Chloe written on red, counting the seconds while nothing has happened, but the obsession with
the chromatic and the chromatic again.
the walls, everything yields, opens, explodes like the play of the wind.
Keep going.
Yes, I feel the moment has come for us to look back, if we can.
Yes, I
And
feel
take our
the
bearings,
has come.
if we are to know.
I must not forget this. I have not forgotten it, but I must have said this before. Since I say it now, they think I'm not in a room either. So there is an audience. It's a fantastic public performance.
And the curtain comes down for the 9th time. You never noticed you were waiting. You were waiting alone. That is the show. Keep going.
Postmodern quotation can be simpler audible manipulations of existing material, like Berio's Schubert reworking in Rendering, where time seems to smear and pause in places, only to resume classical elegance as if nothing at all had happened. Ives also pioneered another form of musical disunity, that of independent strands of time, often doing radically different things. When the strings, trumpet, and winds are separated by space, musical material, and tempo in The Unanswered Question, or when multiple conductors have to work together to tackle the Fourth Symphony, the structure of time itself becomes disunified, fragmented, and nonlinear. This is not to say that any flexible, inexact treatment of time is postmodern. Kramer's non-checklist always has its counterexamples. In these cases, I find that local disunity is subservient to a higher level of structural unity. Lutoslawski's limited aleatory, where entire sections of an orchestra play in loose alignment, is a version of this temporal fragmentation. But in Lutoslawski's music, the local disunity is for the sake of a particular texture that couldn't be notated any other way. In the case of Lutoslawski's Venetian Games, it's a very segmented structure and a set of fixed register, symmetrical, limited interval 12-tone chords. Whatever stuff he's doing with time on the small scale is subservient to this larger unity. The postmodern buffet allows composers to go from one thing to another in quick succession without caring much for the discrepancy between these individual things. Alfred Schnittke's approach, called polystylism, involved adjacent movements or sections in vastly different styles. His first Concerto Grosso uses a Baroque form. It starts with a prepared piano, and after a very slow and creepy first movement, launches into a Vivaldi parody in the second. Schnittke tried to unify sections by focusing on certain intervals, but in my opinion, this just isn't enough to overcome the sheer sense of disunity. In the United States, George Rochberg's approach, something he called ars combinatoria, was pretty similar. He wrote about standing in a circle of time and just picking out what he wanted. One of his first stabs at this was his Third Symphony. Highly intertextual, lots of quotation, definitely postmodern. Like, if that's not postmodern, I don't know what piece is. But it was also a failure. Because in my mind, he's trying to do Berlioz's Sinfonia Movement 3, but without a central skeletal structure in the way that Berio uses Mahler. It's like a stew without a broth, almost. Rockberg scaled back from this and then produced his third string quartet, where the treatment of material in the outer movements is highly disjunct. On top of this, the central movement of this 5-movement arch is an extended throwback to the early Romantic literature. It sounds like Beethoven. Nothing in this piece really prepares you for what's coming next. Again, this is one of the central pieces that people cite when they talk about musical postmodernism. Even further afield from this is the work of John Zorn, whose disjunct works are often inspired by the cartoon scores of Warner Brothers composer Carl Stalling. Unlike Rockberg and Schnittke, who at least thought of some broad connections between segments, Zorn's work is highly fragmented. In Cat o' Nine Tails, pretty much every measure is a new idea, and it's impossible to predict what's going to happen next. And this piece has an actual, honest-to-goodness, whipping scene. He called it Tex Avery Directs the Marquis de Sade for a reason. And if you don't know who those people are, please only Google the former. Postmodern music can also be quite funny. When two things contradict, there's potential for humor and irony, especially when dealing with the past. It is a critical revisiting, writes Hutchin, an ironic dialogue with the past of both art and society. Zorn's music, I think, has a whole lot of that, but of course there are other examples. John Oswald coined the term plunderphonics to refer to a genre of music that used finished recordings as raw material, and where, importantly, a listener can hear and know the source. Plunderphonics relishes in the idea that listeners can recognize the source material. Oswald encourages piracy of this work because it's derivative and he wasn't trying to make money off it. That said, he did get in trouble with the Canadian recording industry in the late 1980s because of his parody of Michael Jackson, which is a story for a different time. This 2-disc set has a ton of different examples, including a radio preacher layered over Led Zeppelin, parts of what he called a more or less backwards Beatles album, and a version of Dolly Parton's The Great Pretender that slows down continuously. In the index, all of the original artists have anagrammatic pseudonyms. So many of these tracks do the same thing with the music. It's all cut up and reordered. It makes total sense to do that here as well. Oswald's work also engages with the classical world. There's one which is just 24 different recordings of Also sprach Zarathustra played at the same time. One of my favorites is when he took a Glenn Gould recording, ran it through a MIDI converter, then used that to control a sampled version of one of Gould's pianos, which sounds complicated, but in the end, you hear the Goldberg variations. It sounds like Gould is playing them, but you also have a bunch of these ghost notes that also sound like Gould is playing them. It's funny, but you also have to know the original recording, and the more you know, the more you can appreciate what Oswald does. Each work plays with musical time, each work leans heavily on listeners' perception of the original works to create meaning, yes, but also humor. And maybe most importantly, there is no score, because there really can't be. To jettison the score is the ultimate questioning of received musical wisdom and the Western art tradition. Today, with so many composers working directly in software, bypassing the traditional score, can we say that we've entered a fully postmodern era? Has postmodernism finally moved from aesthetic attitude into a new artistic epoch? Well, no. At least I don't think so. Of all the composers I admire today, pretty much all of them are working across genres in a way that is synthetic, that builds on one or more traditions, that takes seriously elements of some tradition or another. It's actually trying to build some meaning. That's not postmodernism. The high postmodernist heyday seems to have been the 1960s through the 1980s, and I think we may be on the verge of being able to categorize postmodernity as a quasi-era, an offshoot of modernism in the mid to late 20th century, the last gasp of a set of composers searching for meaning and always coming up short. I don't think it's a coincidence that the techniques and attitudes of postmodernity flourished with composers who felt alienated from a tradition in which they were demographically most represented. There have been, especially during and since the rise of these postmodern tendencies, plenty of incredible women in music, for instance. I just can't think of any I would call postmodern in the same way as the examples I gave. I think there's something there to postmodernism as a kind of 20th century identity crisis, when composition began wrestling with deep and existential questions about its role in the world. You can almost hear composers ask the question, why do any of this? What's the point? Leonard Bernstein thought that Berlioz' Sinfonia was a hopeful and even optimistic view of music in the 20th century. But for him, that was part of a larger argument about the re-embrace of tonality, the poetry of earth, as he called it. And I disagree with old Lenny here, because if you look behind the surface of this piece, it's nihilism with a happy face. At a climactic moment in the third movement, the first tenor desperately cries out that it can't stop the wars, can't make the old younger or lower the price of bread, can't erase solitude or dull the tread outside the door. All you can do, all you must do, is keep going on, believing that music does have some kind of greater spiritual power, even though postmodernism says, no, that's a narrative, and you have to jettison those narratives. In a lot of ways, this movement reminds me of Robin Williams' incredible stream of consciousness energy that it turned out just masks depression and inner torment.
We've got it on the wrong speed. For those of you who are recovering from a hangover, that's going to sound just right.
If you question all narratives, as postmodernism makes you do, well, that just removes the ability for music to mean anything. Right? Well, there's a lot of people who would disagree with me on that, and that's part of the beauty. I'm curious to know what you think about all this. Is postmodernism a thing? Was it a thing? And is it even relevant today?